What if I told you that the Europe you know is not the first? What if, beneath modern roads, churches, and cities, there are layers of a past that tried to survive, but was silenced? Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine the European continent as an old storybook. Stone. Each civilization wrote a sentence. Each war tore a page. Every empire tried to erase what came before. Still, some words remain. Dunks, fragmented, waiting to be read again. As children, we learn that history follows a clear line. Hunters, farmers, kingdoms, empires, progress. But there is something uncomfortable about this narrative. A silence, strange between chapters, as if someone had ripped out entire pages before give us the book, because certain ruins don't match the time in which they were supposedly built. Certain stones look too old. Certain structures would require knowledge that, officially, they did not yet exist. And when these questions arise, something curious happens. The subject changes. The debate cools down. Silence returns. Europe holds deep memories. Memories that don't just live in archives or museums, but underground, in the mountains, in the forgotten valleys, and in the sealed caves by time. There are cities beneath cities, temples under churches, structures so old that they belong to no flag, no language, no known name. Maybe you've already felt this, that strange familiarity when visiting an old place, as if the body recognizes something that the mind doesn't. Remember, as if the soul touched a memory that was never taught in school. Science begins to find clues. Archaeology sometimes stumbles upon questions uncomfortable, and spirituality whispers what books dare not affirm. Humanity forgot more than he remembers. We're not talking about fantasy. We are talking about real ruins, of excavated tunnels with impossible precision, of geometric alignments that cross continents, from structures that have survived glaciations, floods, and cultural collapses. Something existed here before. Something that knew the stone, the sky, and time in a different way. And perhaps the most disturbing thing is not what was lost, but what was deliberately ignored. If you feel like certain things are no coincidence, maybe this video is just the thing that you needed to find now, not to receive ready answers, but to learn to ask questions again. Old questions. Deep. Humans. Throughout this journey, we will not rush. Let's dig, layer by layer, with respect for mystery and humility in the face of the unknown. Because some truths don't they scream, they wait. And as we descend, a question begins to echo, becoming clearer and clearer. What if the ruins that history has tried to erase are, in fact, fragments of who we were? And can we still remember? Before maps, before names, before the idea of Europe even existed, this territory I was already breathing. Forests covered almost everything. Rivers ran free. The ice advanced and retreated like an ancient heart, marking the rhythm of the earth. And while official history tells us that only small groups lived here struggling to survive, the evidence begins telling another story, an uncomfortable story. Under cultivated fields and ancient cities, traces appear that do not fit into the known script. Structures aligned with astronomical precision. Stone blocks moved as if weight were irrelevant. Constructions erected in times when, theoretically, human beings barely mastered simple tools. Something doesn't add up, and when something doesn't add up, it's usually ignored. Prehistoric Europe was not empty. She was alive. Ancient people watched the sky with obsessive attention. They knew cycles. They knew when to plant, when to migrate, when wait. But some of these people knew more than just surviving. They planned, they built, they aligned the earth with the cosmos. Stone circles, dolmens, menhirs. For a long time, they were treated as primitive curiosities. Today, analyzed, with modern instruments, they reveal mathematical knowledge, sophisticated geometric and astronomical designs. Not improvisation, intention, coded memory in stone. And here a question arises that has echoed for decades, but is rarely pursued to the end. Of where did this knowledge come from? The traditional narrative suggests slow, almost accidental evolution. But the reality found on European soil, it points to leaps, sudden advances, as if an inheritance had been received, and then forgotten, or maybe hidden. There are places where archaeological layers seem out of order, where ancient ruins support more recent structures, as if later civilizations had built on top of something they no longer fully understood. Churches built over temples, temples on even older structures, an overlay that is not just architectural but symbolic. Every new culture does not start from scratch. She inherits, reinterpret. Sometimes it goes out. Modern science is beginning to admit that the end of the last ice age was not a simple quiet thaw. It was a period of instability, abrupt rise of the seas, collapses environmental. If coastal civilizations existed before this event, they would have been swallowed, their centers erased, its survivors forced to migrate, taking fragments of knowledge with you. Perhaps this is why certain myths are repeated throughout Europe. Stories of ages golden, from times before the fall, of lost knowledge, not as fantasy, but as an emotional memory passed down through generations. The Europe we learn about at school is young, but real Europe is old, much more older than we are ready to admit. And the more we dig, the clearer it becomes that the past is not linear. It is circular, fractured, alive. If something inside you starts to feel like this story is bigger than it seems, remain. Because when we look at these forgotten ruins, we are not just looking backwards. We are beginning to see the contours of a truth that still insists to emerge. There are times when the stone tells a different story than the one the books insist on. Repeat, not in words but in weight, angle, and silence. Europe is full of these places, structures that exist but shouldn't exist like that. In various parts of the continent, ruins appear that seem out of place in time. Walls made up of gigantic blocks, fitted together with millimeter precision, without mortar. Stones so well fitted that a blade cannot pass between them. Techniques that, officially, they would only appear thousands of years later. Still, there they are, exposed to wind, rain, oblivion. What's most disturbing is not just the age of these structures but the logic behind them. Some were built in unlikely locations, on top of mountains, on land unstable, far from any obvious resource. This requires planning, logistics, in-depth knowledge of the environment. None of this matches the image of society's improvised groups fighting just for survival. In certain places, marks left on the stone suggest methods that defy explanation. Simple, cuts too straight, level surfaces as if they had been polished. It's not that our ancestors were incapable. It's just that what we see seems to indicate something different of what we were taught. And then come the dates. Some ruins are officially attributed to relatively recent cultures, but when the surrounding soil is analyzed, when sediments, erosion, and geological layers enter the equation, inconsistencies arise. Structures that appear to have been reused, reformed, adapted, as if whoever came later was not the original builder, but just the heir to something older. This creates a quiet discomfort in archaeology, because accepting this means admitting that there was a before that we don't know about, a lost chapter, and lost chapters destabilize certainties. There is also the standard. These ruins are not isolated. Many seem to be part of larger networks, aligned with solar, lunar, or stellar phenomena. It's no coincidence. It's not decoration. It is symbolic language written in stone, a language that speaks of cycles, of long period of continuity. For centuries, these constructions were called primitive, ritual, too symbolic to be taken seriously. But symbols are also technology, a technology of mind, collective memory, orientation in the world. What happens when a civilization disappears? Your buildings fall. Their names are they lose. But its most resistant structures remain. And whoever comes after tries explain with the tools you have. Sometimes it gets it right. It often oversimplifies. Maybe that's why so many European ruins seem out of place, because they belong to a logic that is no longer ours. They were made for a different world, a different climate, a different relationship with time and the earth. And there is something even more unsettling. In some cases, when new analyses begin to point to older ages or unexpected functions, the reaction is not curiosity. It is excessive caution, reduction of debate, polite silence, as if certain questions were too dangerous. But the stone doesn't forget. She just waits. And the more we look at these ruins that don't fit together, the more difficult it becomes to sustain the idea that it all started where they said it started. Perhaps the problem is not a lack of evidence, Maybe it's the fear of what these tests would force us to rewrite. There is a curious moment in every deep investigation, an invisible point where questions keep advancing. But answers start to recede, not for lack of data, but out of caution. This is exactly where silence comes into play. The official story does not outright lie. She selects, organize, prioritize, and sometimes it leaves out everything that doesn't fit into a comfortable line of progress. And when a discovery threatens the balance of this narrative, the tone changes. The excitement becomes prudence. Curiosity becomes a footnote. There is no need to imagine grandiose conspiracies. Silence is often born from something simplest and most human, the need for stability. Institutions are built on consensus. Academic careers depend on them. Books, curricula, museums, everything organizes around a structure that needs to appear solid. Question the foundations. It is not just an intellectual exercise, it's a risk. Therefore, when evidence appears that certain ruins may be older than they appear to be, thought, or that certain peoples mastered unexpected knowledge, the answer, it is rarely enthusiasm. It's containment. There is still not enough evidence. It could be coincidence. It's too early to draw conclusions. Safe phrases that close doors without. It looks like they are closing them. But the curious thing is that this pattern repeats itself. Isolated discoveries could be discarded. But when different sites, in different regions of Europe, point to the same chronological discomfort, the silence begins to seem less casual, start to look like a mechanism. The history we learn has been shaped to explain the present. It serves to tell us who we are, where we come from, and why the world is the way it is. Change the past means tinkering with these responses. It means admitting that we may not be the pinnacle inevitable straight line, but just another chapter in a cyclical story, full of rises and falls. And that is deeply disturbing. Because if advanced civilizations existed before and disappeared, what does that say about our own permanence? If knowledge can be lost, progress ceases to be warranty, it becomes responsibility. Historical silence is also fueled by another force, cultural discomfort. Some discoveries challenge not just dates but identities. They question borders, modern, national narratives, ideas of origin. And when the story threatens to become less ours and more human, more shared, more ancient, it loses its usefulness politics. Thus, silence does not scream. It softens. He frames it. He says that certain questions are interesting but irrelevant, that certain mysteries are curious but not important, and little by little the extraordinary is pushed to the margins. Still, the silence is never complete. There are always cracks left. Researchers independent, scientists willing to follow data wherever it leads, people who they feel like something is missing and they can no longer ignore this feeling. Because the truth has a curious behavior. The more you try to bury it, the more she presses from bottom to top. Like roots breaking concrete, like ruins emerging after centuries of oblivion. Perhaps the greatest secret in history is not what was hidden, but how accustomed we have become to not asking. And when the silence starts to bother you, it's a sign that we're getting closer to something essential. There is a Europe that almost no one sees. A Europe below eye level, below roads, beneath the foundations of modern cities. An underground continent, carved not just by water and time, but by human hands who knew exactly what they were doing. Beneath quiet villages and bustling urban centers lie tunnels, chambers and passages that do not appear on tourist maps. Some are known, but little commented on. Others remain partially sealed. And there are those whose existence is only revealed by chance, when a wall gives way, when an ordinary excavation finds something that is not should be there. These spaces are not improvised. Many feature complex ventilation, drainage, hidden entrances, and clear functional divisions, places to store, in order to gather, to hide, to wait. This requires more than brute force, requires vision long-term. The most intriguing thing is that these underground structures appear in different regions of the world. Europe, separated by hundreds or thousands of kilometers but sharing principles similar, calculated depth, strategic use of rock, precise knowledge of soil behavior, as if different people had access to the same type of know, or the same need. The traditional explanation says that these spaces only served as a temporary refuge. Wars, invasions, persecutions. And yes, that explains part of it. But it doesn't explain everything. No explains why some of these complexes are too big, too deep, too elaborate to be used only in short emergencies. Some seem to have been designed to last for generations, as if your builders knew that the surface world would not always be safe, as if going down was, at certain times, the only way to continue existing. And here an unsettling question arises. What were they waiting for? Natural cataclysms? Social breakdowns? Abrupt climate changes? The Earth itself. It shows signs of unstable periods, extreme cold and rapid sea rise. See, these events happened in the past with greater force than we remember. The underground did not, it would just be shelter. It would be a survival strategy. There is also the symbolic aspect. Since time immemorial, descending to Earth has always been associated with transformation, the uterus, the cave, the return to the dark before the rebirth. Perhaps these structures were not just physical, but ritual, places where a border between worlds was crossed. The curious thing is that many of these underground passages were reused over the years. Centuries. Romans adapted older tunnels. Medieval churches rose over crypts that already existed. Castles were built with access to underground networks that no one else knew how to fully explain it. Layers upon layers. Use over use, but rarely origin. When memory of the original purpose is lost, only the immediate function remains. And so, something that was perhaps designed to preserve knowledge, people, or cycles' entire life, ends up being reduced to a refuge or archaeological curiosity. If you feel a certain weight when imagining all this under your feet, it's no coincidence. Underground carries that which could not remain visible, what needed to be protected or forgotten. And as we follow this journey descending deeper and deeper into these layers hidden from Europe, something begins to become clear. To understand the past, perhaps we shouldn't just look at what was built for be seen, but for that which has been carefully hidden. Earth is not a stable stage. It breathes, it pulses, it moves, and at certain moments, she transforms so abruptly that it erases almost everything that was on it. The story humanity rarely likes to deal with these moments because they break the idea of continuity. But the signs are there. Geological records speak of rapid climate change, of periods when cold advanced violently, unlike others in which the waters rose in a few generations. The end of the last ice age was not a simple gentle thaw. It was a chaotic transition. Ice melting, oceans advancing, entire regions becoming uninhabitable in one interval too short for written memory to keep up. If civilizations existed before these events, they would have faced a brutal choice. Adapt, quickly or disappear. Maybe that's why so many ruins are buried. Not because they were abandoned slowly, but because they were swallowed. Sediment, mud, structural collapse. The type of destruction that leaves no time for goodbyes, only for escape. When this happens, what survives is not the grandeur, but what was designed to resist. Ancient myths seem to echo exactly this. Stories of great floods, from fireworks coming from the sky, of eras destroyed and restarted. For a long time, these narratives were treated as moral allegories, but when science and myth begin to clash point to the same type of event, the line between symbol and memory becomes thinner. In Europe, there are signs of human occupations coming to an abrupt halt. Layers archaeological sites where tools, bones, and structures suddenly stop, as if life had been cut off mid-gesture. In some places, human return happens centuries or millennia later, as if the territory had become hostile for a long period. This suggests something unsettling. History may not be a ladder that goes up one step at a time. But a series of attempts. Rises followed by falls. Forced restarts. When a civilization falls, it doesn't just take buildings with it. It takes systems knowledge, accumulated observations, refined techniques, and what remains for the survivors is fragment. A little no here, a symbol there, a story told around the fire, increasingly distorted. Perhaps this is how certain capabilities seem to appear, out of nowhere, in periods later, not as new inventions but as partial rediscoveries, echoes of something greater that could not be fully transmitted. Fear of collapse also changes the way societies build. After a cataclysm, The priority stops being expansion and becomes preservation, protection, redundancy, safe places, structures that do not attract attention, knowledge stored in symbols, not obvious monuments. This may explain why, after certain periods of destruction, we see cultures more cautious, more ritualistic, more concerned with cycles than with achievements. They learned the hard way that nothing is permanent. And here's the point that's rarely said out loud. If this has happened before, it might happen again. Earth does not promise eternal stability. It offers windows. Perhaps the ancients knew this better than we do. Maybe its buried ruins are just remnants of a lost past, but silent warnings, reminders that the world already it started more times than we can count. And if Europe bears so many marks from these restarts, perhaps we are not just studying history. Perhaps we are looking into a deep mirror, reflecting cycles that have not yet finished. When a civilization falls, not everything is lost at the same time. There are always those who try to save something. Not entire cities, not armies, not grandiose monuments, just fragments, ideas, symbols, mental maps of the world. And these are the fragments that often go through the ages in the hands of a few. Throughout European history, figures and groups emerge whose function seems less political and quieter. Monks who obsessively copy texts, orders that preserve rituals ancient without explaining their origin, builders who repeat specific proportions even when they no longer know why. They are not rulers. They are guardians. These guardians rarely advertise themselves as such. They don't say, "This came from before." They just keep it, repeat, transmit, because when knowledge is dangerous too much to display, the only way to preserve it is to disguise it as tradition. Many European monasteries were built on much older sites, places considered sacred long before Christianity arrived. Fountains, hills, caves. Oh, what changes is the name of the sacred, not the location, as if spiritual geography were more older than any organized religion. In certain medieval manuscripts, symbols appear that do not clearly belong to the Christian theology. Circular diagrams, representations of the cosmos, relationships between numbers, natural forms and cycles. Officially, they are allegories, but allegories are often safes. They keep something inside. Alchemy, for example, was never just about transforming metals. It was a language encoded, a way of talking about deep processes without saying too much. Who doesn't? I was prepared only through fantasy. Whoever was there saw instructions, not just chemicals, but existential. This is repeated in several traditions. Knowledge, fragmented so as not to be destroyed, spread between stories, rituals, architecture, and art. Because a book can be burned, a city can collapse, but a symbol, when well planted, survives in the human mind for millennia. Perhaps this is why certain patterns continually return in Europe. Proportion-specific geometrics, alignments between distant buildings, recurrent use of numbers considered sacred, not because they all matched each other, but because everyone inherited parts of the same old app. The guardians of knowledge were not necessarily a secret elite controlling the world. Often it was just people who knew something was too important to be forgotten, even if they no longer fully understood its meaning. And this creates a paradox. Knowledge survives but is diluted. Every generation understands a little less overall. Still, it keeps its shape, like an old song sung in a language that no longer exists, but whose rhythm remains. The most curious thing is that whenever Europe went through periods of profound collapse, how after the fall of empires or major crises, these fragments returned to the surface. Rediscovered texts, reactivated ideas, knowledge relearned as if it were new. Maybe none of this is a coincidence. Perhaps the past has never been completely erased, just entrusted to the hands wrong for those looking for quick answers, but preserved, with patience, by those who understood that true time is not measured in centuries, but in cycles. And if these guardians existed to cross previous falls, a question arises inevitable, which begins to weigh heavily in the silence. They were just protecting the past, or preparing something for when the world needs to start over again. Erasing is not the same as destroying. Destruction is chaotic, noisy, leaves obvious traces. Erasing is silent. He rearranges, recount, decide what deserves to be remembered, and what must disappear into the margins of time. When we look closely at the European past, we realize that very little was really lost by chance. Wars explain ruins. Natural disasters explain burials. But they do not explain the systematic absence of certain narratives, nor explain why some questions were never asked in sufficient depth. Erasure begins when an alternative history threatens the stability of the current one, when she suggests that the present is neither unique nor definitive, when she remembers that other worlds existed and collapsed. This does not inspire progress. It inspires caution, and caution. It doesn't match empires, nor promises of permanence. Winning civilizations have always rewrote the past, not just to exalt achievements, but to justify power. If the current world is the inevitable result of a long evolution, so whoever governs now seems legitimate. But if the current world is just one more attempt among many, this legitimacy makes it fragile. That's why linear stories are comfortable. They reassure. They say everything gets better with time, that knowledge only accumulates, that there are no big losses, just overcomings. The ruins that contradict this need to be framed, reduced, neutralized. And so, old structures become primitive, complex knowledge becomes coincidence, impressive alignments become symbolic rituals with no practical function. None of this is a direct lie. It is strategic interpretation. Erasure also happens when we no longer know how to ask certain questions. When a finding doesn't fit, it is isolated, treated as an exception. But repeated exceptions cease to be exceptions. They became the standard, and standards require review. There is also a deep psychological aspect to all of this. Accept that great knowledge were lost is painful. It means admitting collective vulnerability. It means recognizing that humanity is not immune to oblivion, that we can fall, and fall badly. Perhaps it is easier to believe that our ancestors were naive, and that we are the first to really understand the world. This idea feeds pride, feeds identity. It feeds the illusion of control. But the ruins do not share this illusion. They remain indifferent to the narratives we try to impose. They just exist, and its existence is enough to cause discomfort. 'Cause every stone out of place, he asks, without words, who was here before you? Erasure does not need to be total to be effective. Just fragment, separate parts that should not meet. A place here, a myth there, an isolated scientific data. While no one connects the dots, the official story remains intact. But when someone starts to put these fragments together, something changes. The past ceases to be a straight line, and it becomes a mosaic. Incomplete, yes, but much more honest. And perhaps that is exactly what has been avoided for so long. Not the absolute truth, but the complexity. Because complexity cannot be easily controlled. What was erased from European history was not just information. It was the notion that already we were different, that we already think differently, that we have already built the world of other shapes. And when recovering this notion, even if in fragments, something essential awakens. The awareness that the future is not guaranteed, and that remembering can be an act of survival. At some point in this journey, the question stops being, what happened before, and starts to turn into, what does this say about us now? Because every time we look at forgotten ruins, we are not just investigating the past. We are facing an uncomfortable reflection of the present. We live surrounded by technology, data, and speed. We have a feeling of control, from domain, of irreversible advancement. And yet all you have to do is observe the world carefully to notice cracks, fragile systems, short memories, decisions made as if the tomorrow was guaranteed. This overconfidence sounds strangely familiar when placed alongside the civilizations that came before us and disappeared. European ruins don't just speak of lost glory. They talk about limits, from moments when knowledge was not enough to prevent the collapse, or maybe was enough for some to survive, but not for all. This distinction is important, because if there were guardians of knowledge in the past, that means not everyone were saved. There were choices, priorities, silent sacrifices, and this forces us to face an uncomfortable truth. In times of deep crisis, humanity rarely behaves as a united whole. It fragments. When we look at the present, we see echoes of this pattern: concentrated information, unequal resources, decisions made by few while many continue without understand the full picture. The difference is that now we believe we know more, that we are more aware, more prepared. But are we? Forgetting the past is not neutral. It shapes our expectations. If we believe that progress is automatic, we feel no urgency to protect it. If we believe that the knowledge is never lost, we do not feel the need to preserve it carefully. See, we believe that collapse is a thing of ancient times. We don't pay attention to the signs. Maybe that's why these ruins cause us so much discomfort when we actually look at them. They break the illusion of exceptionality. They remind us that we are not the first to think we've come too far to fall. The mirror of the present doesn't just show risk. It shows opportunity. Why, remember, it's not just for fear. You can choose differently. To understand which civilizations they do not die only because of external events, but because of internal decisions, due to the inability to adapt values to reality, by refusing to listen to warnings that seem inconvenient too much, underground structures, fragmented knowledge, symbols preserved in silence. All of this points to a lesson that spans time. Surviving is not just physically resist, it's knowing what's worth carrying for the next cycle. If a new restart were necessary, what would we take with us? Just technology? Just data? Or principles? Relations? Wisdom about limits, cycles, and interdependence? Perhaps the biggest mistake of past civilizations was not building too much, but trusting too much in the permanence of what they built. And perhaps our biggest risk is to repeat this error with even more powerful tools. When you look at these ruins, you are not looking at failures. Are you looking at messages that traveled thousands of years to get here? Not in the form of clear words, but with a silent presence. They don't say, "Don't do it." They ask, "Did you learn?" And this question is not addressed to governments nor to institutions. She is intimate, individual, human, because in the end, it is not ancient Europe that is at stake. It's the way we choose to remember, or forget, who we are when everything else disappears. Perhaps what scares the most is not the idea of forgotten civilizations, but the feeling that we have been here before, looking at all that has been revealed: ruins out of time, buried structures, convenient silences, fragmented knowledge. A perception arises that is difficult to understand, ignore. Human history is not a triumphal march towards the light. She is a travesty, at times illuminated, sometimes in the dark, always fragile. The ruins beneath Europe do not call for veneration. They ask to be listened to, not as someone who seeks ready answers, but as someone who accepts that the past speaks in layers, in echoes, in subtle signs. Every stone moved, every tunnel forgotten, every structure reused by cultures that no longer remembered their origin. All of this points to something bigger than dates and names, points to cycles. Civilizations are born believing that they will last forever. They grow up convinced that your knowledge is definitive, and at some point they begin to confuse progress with invulnerability. This is where the balance breaks. Not all at once, but little by little. First, memory shortens. Afterwards, the warnings are ignored. Finally, the collapse. Stops seem impossible. The ancients seem to have understood something that we still resist accepting. The earth does not belong to no era. It only allows passages, windows of stability between periods of profound transformation. Those who understand this build differently, live different guard. Maybe that's why so many structures were made to last in silence and not to shine. Maybe that's why the most sensitive knowledge was hidden in symbols, not proclaimed in squares. Maybe that's why descending to earth has so often been a gesture of wisdom, not fear. And here, in the present, faced with a world that changes too quickly, these ruins return to life. Speak, not as a threat, as a souvenir. They remind us that no technology replaces consciousness, that no accumulation of data compensates for the loss of meaning, that surviving is not just maintaining systems functioning, but preserve what makes us human when systems fail. The future does not require us to fear the past. He demands that we learn from him. What let us recognize patterns. May we accept limits. May we know what needs to be protected when everything else seems transitory. Perhaps the ruins that history has tried to erase are not mistakes to be forgotten, but messages carefully left for anyone willing to look closely. Humility. They don't say, "You're going to fall." They say, "This has already happened." And that difference changes everything. Because if it has already happened, it can also be crossed. With more awareness. With more be careful. With more memory. Throughout this journey, you have not been asked to believe in a definitive new version of history. He was asked to remember that the truth rarely fits into a single narrative, that the past is vaster than we have been taught, and that the future largely depends part of what we choose not to forget. If this message touched something in you, if any part of this story awakened you more questions than answers, perhaps this is no coincidence. Maybe it's a calling silent, an invitation to continue digging, not just the soil of Europe, but the layers of consciousness itself. Sign up and follow us on this journey, not to escape the present, but to go through it more clearly. Because remembering is not looking back, it's preparing the spirit for what is yet to come. And before you leave, let this question echo. No rush, no need for an answer immediate. What if what we call the end is just the beginning of a memory that the soul human hasn't forgotten yet?